All right, welcome back, deep divers. Ready for another fascinating exploration.
Always eager to dive in.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, today we're going to be tackling a topic that's sparked quite a bit of debate and discussion over the centuries. The origins of Mahayana Buddhism and its key texts, the Mahayana Sutras.
It's a topic that goes to the very heart of what it means to be Buddhist, really.
Right. And we've got some really intriguing sources that delve into this question of whether these teachings were present from the very beginning or emerged later. What are your initial thoughts?
Well, just to start us off, I think it's fascinating that the Mahayana Sutras themselves claim to contain the direct teachings of the Buddha.
Yeah, that's a pretty bold claim.
It is. But there's been, as you mentioned, a lot of discussion about when and where these texts actually originated.
And where they fit into the broader historical narrative of Buddhism.
Exactly.
One of the things that really caught my eye as I was reading through this material was this story about Nagarjuna, a key figure in Mahayana Buddhism, bringing the Prajñāpāramitā Sutras back from the serpent realm.
Oh, yeah. That's a story that's captured the imagination of many. It's almost like something straight out of a myth.
Right. It makes you wonder what to make of it.
It does. And while that story has been used by some to question the authenticity of these texts, it's important to remember that Nagarjuna himself argued that the concept of emptiness, which is so central to those sutras, is actually already present in earlier Buddhist teachings.
So he's saying that the seeds of Mahayana thought are already there.
Exactly. He saw it as a development, a natural progression. And, he's not alone in this view. There are accounts from ancient Nalanda masters like Acharya Dharmamitra, and he believed that both Sravakayana and Mahayana Sutras were recited at the very first Buddhist council in Rajagriha, right after the Buddha's passing.
But he's putting them right there at the start.
He is. He saw them as part of a unified Buddhist teaching. Although I have to say, another Nalanda master, Acharya Bhaviviveka, offered a slightly different perspective.
Oh, really? This is getting interesting.
It is. In his book Tarkajwala, which, by the way, translates to Blaze of Reasoning.
Okay, I'm hooked already. Blaze of Reasoning. What did he have to say?
Well, he argued that while the Sravakayana Sutras were being recited at one location in Rajgir, the Mahayana Sutras were being recited at a different location, simultaneously, by prominent bodhisattvas like Samantabhadra and Manjusri.
So both sets of teachings were present, just not in the same place.
That's his argument. And believe it or not, there's even more. That Chinese traveler Xuanzang, who went to India in the 7th century, wrote about a stupa where a large gathering of both Shravakas and Bodhisattvas compiled 5 pitakas, and one of them was a Dharani pitaka, which is often associated with Mahayana teachings.
Wow. So we have multiple accounts from various sources suggesting that Mahayana teachings might have been present at that very first council. That's a pretty strong argument for their early origins.
It definitely adds a layer of complexity to the debate.
It challenges the idea that it came later.
Right. Because some people do believe that,
Yeah. And I want to get into that. So if we're looking at these accounts as potentially supporting this idea that Mahayana teachings were present from the beginning, what about those who say, no, they came later? What are they basing their skepticism on?
Well, one of the main points of contention is the emphasis on the Bodhisattva ideal in Mahayana Buddhism.
Okay, the Bodhisattva, the one who delays their own enlightenment to help all beings achieve Buddhahood.
Exactly. And that's central to Mahayana, but it's not as explicitly emphasized in those earlier Buddhist texts. So some argue, you see, that this difference in focus points to a later development.
So they're seeing that focus on individual liberation in those earlier texts and saying, that's a different path.
That's how they're interpreting it. But to be fair, if you dig into those Mahayana Sutras, they present a more nuanced view.
How so?
Well, look at the Prajñāpāramitā Sutras, considered some of the earliest Mahayana texts. They distinguish between different vehicles, different paths.
In Buddhism.
Yeah. You've got the Sravakayana and Pratyeka-Buddhayana, which focus on individual liberation. And then they introduce the Mahayana, the greater vehicle.
Greater, in what sense?
In terms of its scope, its ambition, it's about universal liberation, driven by compassion, that bodhisattva ideal. It's not about rejecting individual liberation, but expanding it to include all beings.
So it's not a total departure, but like an evolution.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that the Prajñāpāramitā Sutras themselves actually differentiate between those paths. So that idea of a greater vehicle was present pretty early on, it seems.
All right, so we're starting to see how these pieces fit together. But I'm curious, what about those who still aren't convinced that the Mahayana Sutras are the actual words of the Buddha? What are their main concerns?
Well, one thing that often comes up is this idea. If the Mahayana teachings are so essential for achieving Buddhahood, why weren't they taught more directly by the Buddha himself?
Yeah, it's like, if this is the express lane to enlightenment, why didn't we hear about it from the get-go?
Exactly. And those critics will point to the fact that the Mahayana Sutras introduce new things that seem to go beyond what the Buddha taught in the early scriptures.
Okay, like what? Give me an example.
Okay, well, think about the idea of countless Buddhas and celestial bodhisattvas residing in pure lands, like Amitabha Buddha in Sukhavati.
Okay, yeah. That's definitely a big part of Mahayana Buddhism.
Huge. But it's not really there in those earliest texts.
It does add a whole new layer of cosmology and mythology to Buddhism.
It does, and some critics see this as a shift away from the Buddha's emphasis on direct experience and those Four Noble Truths. They say all the elaborate rituals and visualizations and devotion to these celestial beings can distract from the core practices: mindfulness, meditation, ethical conduct.
So they're saying the Mahayana's gotten a bit too fancy.
Yeah, kind of straying from the original simplicity. But, Mahayana proponents would argue that these practices are skillful means, upaya, designed to help people connect with the Dharma in a way that works for them.
Right. Like those sand mandalas Tibetan monks make, they're incredibly intricate and beautiful, but they're also a tool for contemplation, a reminder of impermanence.
Precisely. And Mahayana scholars would emphasize that all of these practices ultimately aim to cultivate wisdom and compassion, which are, the core qualities of a bodhisattva, essential for achieving Buddhahood.
So it seems like this debate really comes down to different interpretations of what constitutes authentic Buddhism.
I think that's a good way to put it. It's important to remember that within Buddhism, there's always been this history of different schools of thought and interpretations evolving over time.
So no one right answer, really.
Not really. I think the beauty of Buddhism is that it encourages critical thinking, personal exploration. You study the teachings, you engage in the practices, and you figure out what resonates most deeply with you.
I like that. It's not about just accepting dogma blindly, but it's about a process of inquiry.
Exactly. And as you delve deeper into the world of Mahayana Buddhism, you're going to encounter this rich tapestry of philosophical ideas, spiritual practices, inspiring stories, things that have touched the lives of so many people throughout history.
That's such a good point. We've been so focused on this debate about origins and authenticity that we haven't even gotten to the real impact this has had on art, literature, culture, and of course, the spiritual lives of millions.
Absolutely. And those are areas worth exploring. The Mahayana tradition is a vast landscape for anyone seeking deeper meaning, wisdom, and compassion.
Well said. So to our deep diver out there who's been thinking about all of this with us, keep digging, keep questioning, and keep that mind open as you continue to journey through this intricate and inspiring world of Mahayana Buddhism.
And remember, the most important question isn't, is this authentic? It's, does this lead to greater wisdom, compassion, and ultimately freedom from suffering?
Beautiful. Thanks for diving deep with us.
My pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring. All right, so we've talked about some of those accounts suggesting that Mahayana teachings might actually go back further than some people think. But now I'm curious about how those early Mahayana masters actually defended these teachings as the genuine word of the Buddha.
Yeah, that's key, right? Because even if those accounts suggest that Mahayana teachings were around, it doesn't automatically mean that they perfectly reflect what the Buddha intended.
Right, exactly. So how did they actually make their case?
Well, one of the most compelling arguments comes from Nagarjuna, The same Nagarjuna, remember, who brought back those Prajñāpāramitā Sutras.
Right, from the serpent realm.
Yeah, that's the one. He didn't just retrieve those texts, though. He also wrote extensively about them, defending their authenticity and explaining how they align with those core Buddhist principles.
So he wasn't just an adventurer. He was a scholar and a defender of these teachings.
Exactly. And one of his key arguments revolves around the concept of emptiness, śūnyatā, which is, of course, so central to the Mahayana Sutras. But Nagarjuna argued that it's not a radical departure from earlier Buddhist thought.
Really?
Yeah. He pointed to the idea of impermanence, which is already a core teaching in early Buddhism. He argued that it implies a lack of inherent, unchanging essence in all things.
I see. So he's drawing a connection between impermanence and emptiness. If things are constantly changing, then they can't have a fixed, independent self.
Precisely. He used this to demonstrate that the Mahayana Sutras' concept of emptiness is just a natural extension, a deepening, if you will, of what the Buddha had already taught.
So he's sort of saying, look, the seeds of this understanding are already there. We're just exploring them more fully.
Exactly. And this approach, this way of showing continuity between early Buddhism and the Mahayana Sutras, was something many masters used. Acharya Maitreyanatha, for example, argued that if the Mahayana teachings really weren't the Buddha's words, then their emergence would have caused a huge disruption in the Buddhist community.
Interesting. Because the Buddha would have known, right?
That's exactly what he argued. Because of the Buddha's omniscience, he would have foreseen all the potential confusion if someone introduced new teachings that went against his own.
So he's saying the Buddha would have warned everyone.
Right. And since he didn't, Maitreyanatha concluded that the Mahayana Sutras must be genuine. It's a really interesting argument based on the Buddha's presumed omniscience and his concern for the Buddhist community.
So it's like saying, hey, if this was a problem, the Buddha would have said something.
Exactly. And Maitreyanatha goes on to suggest that both Shravakana and Mahayana teachings existed at the same time, not one after the other. He basically argues that Mahayana is just a more expansive way of expressing the Buddhist path, but ultimately both lead to the same goal, enlightenment.
So he's not saying Mahayana replaces those earlier teachings, but that it builds upon them, offers a broader perspective.
Right. Which brings us to another interesting point he makes, that Mahayana teachings are actually necessary for reaching full Buddhahood. He says that without those insights and practices from the Mahayana Sutras, complete enlightenment just isn't possible.
Wow, that's a bold statement. He's saying the Mahayana is the most effective path, even necessary.
Yeah, that's his argument. And it's particularly compelling for those who really resonate with that Mahayana vision of universal liberation and the Bodhisattva ideal.
It's like saying, if you really want to help everyone and achieve the highest level of awakening, then this is the way to go.
Exactly. Now, another really important figure who passionately defended the Mahayana Sutras was Acharya Shantideva, a brilliant scholar and meditation master.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What was his take?
Well, he directly addressed those criticisms from the people who followed Shravakayana teachings and rejected Mahayana. He basically challenged them. He said, if you think the Mahayana Sutras are flawed because they aren't the Buddha's words, then how can you be so sure that your own Shravakayana teachings are perfect?
Oh, well, he's calling them out on their own certainty.
Exactly. He was pointing out a potential double standard. He argued that if they didn't accept the Mahayana Sutras as authentic, then they couldn't use those texts to back up their own views.
So they'd have to prove their own teachings were valid in a different way.
Precisely. And Shantideva went on to cite the Atisaya Sanchudana Sutra, which outlines 4 criteria for knowing if a sutra is the Buddha's word. It should be beneficial, not harmful, full of dharma, not unrighteousness, remove suffering, not increase it, and show the qualities of nirvana, not samsara.
So he's saying, look, the Mahayana teachings meet these criteria, so why wouldn't they be considered the Buddha's words?
Exactly. And it underscores a really important point in the Mahayana defense, that emphasis on the practical effects of the teachings.
So it's not just about intellectual debate, it's about whether these teachings actually help people find liberation from suffering.
Exactly. And that's a question that everyone has to consider for themselves when exploring the world of Mahayana Buddhism.
It seems like those early Mahayana masters really shaped how we understand these teachings today. Their insights and arguments are still influencing how we approach these texts.
Absolutely. And the fact that these teachings still spark debate and inspire deep reflection after so many centuries speaks to their lasting power.
I agree. Well, I'm definitely eager to hear more about the legacy of these teachings and how they've impacted Buddhist thought and practice.
Me too. There's still so much more to explore.
Okay, deep divers, get ready to dive even deeper as we continue to explore this amazing world of Mahayana Buddhism in part 3. Okay, so we've delved pretty deep into those early debates about the Mahayana Sutras, but, looking at all of these sources, it really hits you just how much impact those teachings have had.
It's one thing to have those theoretical debates, the textual analysis and all of that.
Right.
But then you see how these ideas have actually influenced people's lives.
And shape Buddhism as a whole.
Exactly.
So what would you say are some of the most significant ways that these Mahayana Sutras have left their mark?
Well, one of the most obvious is just the appearance of whole new schools of thought and practice that are based on these teachings. You look at East Asia, you see Zen Buddhism developing, drawing heavily on those Prajñāpāramitā Sutras.
With that focus on emptiness.
Right. Non-dual awareness, all of that.
And then, of course, you have Tibetan Buddhism.
Of course, which brings in elements of Mahayana and Vajrayana.
With that strong emphasis on the Bodhisattva ideal.
Absolutely. And those are just two examples. Really, the Mahayana Sutras have had a huge influence on Buddhist art, literature, and culture all across Asia and beyond.
One of the sources even talks about how the idea of pure lands like Amitabha Buddha's Sukhavati has inspired so many artists and writers, depicting these amazing realms of bliss.
Oh, absolutely. And they provide a vision of spiritual liberation.
And it wasn't just inspiration, was it? They also helped to spread those teachings, right?
Oh, yeah. They made them much more accessible to a wider audience.
Because it gave people a more concrete way to connect with those ideas.
Yeah, they're not always the easiest to grasp, are they?
Not at all. And that's something really interesting about the Mahayana tradition. That emphasis on skillful means, upaya.
Using whatever works best to help people understand and practice the Dharma.
So it's not about sticking to rigid rules, but about adapting and meeting people where they are.
Exactly. And I think that's a big reason why the Mahayana spread so successfully around the world. It's grounded in the Buddhist teachings, but also incredibly flexible.
As we're talking about this, I keep coming back to this question of what does all of this mean for us today? We've talked about the history, the debates, the impact, but what does it all really boil down to for someone who's just starting to learn about this?
That's a great question. I think the most important thing to remember is that the Mahayana offers this path that involves both personal transformation and engaging with the world around us.
How so?
Well, on a personal level, those teachings encourage us to cultivate wisdom, compassion, and ethical conduct in our own lives. It gives us tools to understand the nature of reality, our place in it.
So it's about working on ourselves.
Yeah, developing those inner qualities. But it doesn't stop there. The Mahayana also emphasizes the importance of sharing that compassion with others, working to help alleviate suffering.
That bodhisattva ideal again.
Yes, that commitment to helping all beings achieve liberation. And this can take so many forms, from small acts of kindness to social activism, working to create a more just and equitable world.
So it's about seeing your own liberation as connected to everyone else's liberation.
Exactly. And that's something that's especially important in today's world, wouldn't you say?
Definitely.
So many challenges. Climate change, social injustice, political divides. The Mahayana teachings can offer us a way to approach those things with wisdom and compassion.
With the goal of helping everyone.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even amidst all the difficulties, we can work towards peace and a more compassionate world.
So for all of our deep divers out there who have joined us on this journey, what's the most important thing to take away from this?
Don't be afraid to explore, to ask those questions. Engage with these teachings in a way that speaks to you. There's no one right way to approach it. It's a vast, multifaceted tradition.
I love that. It's about that personal journey of discovery.
It is, and it's a journey that can lead to amazing insights, life-changing experiences, a sense of purpose and connection.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And for all of you listening, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep opening your hearts to the wisdom and compassion that these teachings offer. Until next time.